Hello everyone, today is Wednesday, December 8th, Eastern Time. Here is the 8th issue of Bronco Review. Today we talk about Xi Jinping's stupid failure in handling Hong Kong elections, Taiwan relations, and Russian relations. The Chinese version was released on November 27, 2021, and the English version will be released today. There may be many grammatical errors, but I will appreciate your patience very much. First, let's talk about the fourth failure of Xi Jinping, Hong Kong. First of all, please allow me to pay tribute to the people of Hong Kong. In the past 2 years, while fighting the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party, they have demonstrated to the world the shocking qualities of Hong Kong people through peaceful demonstrations of millions of people in an orderly manner. No country can achieve an orderly peaceful demonstration organized by millions of people like Hong Kong. This incident completely penetrated the CCP's lie that Chinese people are low in quality and not suitable for democracy. It is not true that the Chinese people are not suitable for democracy because of their low quality. It is because people with low quality are ruling China and they are afraid of democracy. Please watch the short video and let us relive those tearful scenes.
因為我哋已經冇晒退路，我哋太多嘅妥協啦，所以更加要俾佢哋睇到香港人嘅決心。
The people of Hong Kong are out in the streets.
呢個遊行對香港嘅未來可以話係歷史性嘅一刻咯，係香港。
Hundreds of thousands are demonstrating against a deeply unpopular bill.
呢個會影響全香港嘅市民咯。
因為呢條條例對香港嘅傷害係非常之大嘅。
But this is about a whole lot more than a bill. It's about the status of Hong Kong and the power China has over it. It's a fight to preserve the freedoms people have here, and it all started with a murder. But Hong Kong has been pushing back. In 2003, 500,000 Hong Kongers successfully fought legislation that would have punished speaking out against China. And in 2014, tens of thousands of protesters occupied the city for weeks to protest China's influence over Hong Kong's elections. Now, Hong Kongers are fighting the extradition bill because the bill is widely seen as the next step in China's encroachment on Hong Kong's autonomy.
因為我哋對呢個中國嘅法律係冇信心。
任何一個市民，如果係大陸政權，佢係唔中意你，佢可以用一個任何嘅理由。
如果那说难聽點，如果他們條例通過，那就代表香港淪陷。
And it's driven hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers into the streets.
其實民主的基礎本來就是建立在人民上的，所以大家都走出來，那你還能不重視這個事件嗎？
The founder of the new China Federation, Mr. Guo Wengui, once said that Hong Kong will be the first domino of the CCP to collapse, and I think so too. In 2019, the Hong Kong demonstrations triggered by the Hong Kong government's promotion of the amendment to the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance lasted from the summer to the second year. Although Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has officially announced the withdrawal of the amendments to the regulations in order to meet the demands of the demonstrators. However, the voice of the 5 major demands, one is indispensable, is still lingering. The arrested demonstrators were released unconditionally. An independent investigation committee was established to investigate the conflicts between the police and the people, and the demonstrators' right characterization was abolished, so that the Legislative Council and the chief executive were elected as soon as possible by dual universal suffrage. Among the remaining 4 demands, double universal suffrage are undoubtedly the most important. Regardless of Hong Kong's sovereignty transfer, the issue of universal suffrage has always been an issue that cannot be avoided when discussing Hong Kong's democracy. At the same time, This issue has become the epitome of the constantly torn Sino-Hong Kong relationship. The protests triggered by the anti-Sand once again brought the issue of dual universal suffrage into focus. Subsequently, the CCP imposed national siku laws in Hong Kong, arresting and killing countless innocent young students and citizens, which was tantamount to smashing Hong Kong completely. The Pole of the Orient was covered in dust, and its glory was no longer there. Is true universal suffrage contradictory with one country, two systems? The amendment to the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance that caused the disturbance in the summer of 2019 is a good example. In February 2019, the Hong Kong government proposed to amend the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance, even after the organizers announced a large-scale demonstration against this action involving 1 million people on June 9. The Hong Kong government still insisted on pushing for the second reading of the bill. More and more people in Hong Kong know that the chief executive is worse than the other because the chief executives are all selected by Beijing and they are not responsible to the people of Hong Kong, said Xu Jinping, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. The chief executive that Hong Kong people want is someone who can truly tell Beijing what Hong Kong people think, not someone who can only instill Beijing's will into Hong Kong. The Basic Law, which came into effect on July 1, 1997, pointed out that if the method for selecting the chief executive needs to be modified after 2007, 2/3 of the Legislative Council's approval, the chief executive's approval, and the approval of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress are required. The amendment is simpler. After 2/3 of the Legislative Council passes and the chief executive agrees, it is reported to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress for the record. The 4 words "if it needs to be modified" give many people imagination. Hong Kong current affairs commentator Lung Kai, who wrote an article that according to this provision, at the beginning of the establishment of the SAR, Hong Kong generally believed that the election of the chief executive in 2007 and the election of the Legislative Council in 2008 would be the earliest opportunity for Hong Kong to achieve dual universal suffrage. However, in 2004, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of China took the initiative to interpret the law and increased the procedures for the amendment of the chief executive and the method of forming the Legislative Council to 5 steps. The chief executive must first submit a report. After the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress determines that the SAR government proposes corresponding amendments, the Chinese National People's Congress also stated that universal suffrage will not be implemented in the 2007 chief executive election and the 2008 Legislative Council election. This arrangement gave the Chinese government the initiative to limit the process and space for Hong Kong's democratization. Hong Kong's political reform mechanism has been far from the original vision of many people. After the 2007 and 2008 double universal suffrage expectations fell through, the establishment political party, the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong, proposed a 2012 double universal suffrage plan in 2005. But this timetable was also rejected by Beijing. This time Beijing has given a new timetable. Universal suffrage will be implemented in the 2017 chief executive election, and universal suffrage will also be implemented in the subsequent Legislative Council elections. After the timetable was determined, on August 31, 2014, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress of China held a meeting in Beijing to deliberate on the Hong Kong Political Reform Report and announced the resolution referred to as the August 31 decision. Among them, clear regulations on the composition of the nomination committee responsible for nominating candidates for the chief executive and the limit on the number of candidates for the chief executive have set out clear regulations, making many Hong Kong people think that true universal suffrage has failed, triggering a greater political crisis in Hong Kong. The Chief Executive's Nomination Committee consists of a 1,200-member election committee. As long as they get the support of 601 people, they can select candidates. The whole process has nothing to do with the people of Hong Kong. Many people think that these 1,200 people cannot represent all Hong Kong people, and therefore demand a change in the electoral system. However, The decision of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress on August 31, 2014 stated that even if the chief executive is to be elected by universal suffrage of one person, one vote in the future, candidates must first be selected by the 1,200-member nomination committee, and more than half of them must be supported, can become a formal candidate. In other words, Hong Kong people fought for universal suffrage because they felt that the 1,200 people were not representative. The subsequent reform plan did not replace the 1,200 people, but instead gave them more privileges. Hong Kong people felt deceived. The official name of these 1,200 people is the Election Committee, and the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress decided to make them the nomination committee for the general election of the chief executive. The representativeness of these 1,200 people was one of the core controversies at the time. First of all, there are more than 3.5 million voters in Hong Kong who can vote in the Legislative Council and District Council elections, but fewer than 240,000 voters can directly participate in the formation of the election committee. In other words, there were already more than 3 million people that this election committee could not represent. A closer look at the composition of the election committee reveals that its representativeness is extremely uneven. For example, 30 members of the committee are representatives of the education sector, elected by the teaching staff of primary and secondary schools, and there are a total of 81,831 voters registered in the education sector. Another 60 people on the committee are representatives of the agriculture and fisheries sectors. Hong Kong is a modern city, and agriculture and fisheries account for only a small part of the population and economic output. Now there are only more than 4,000 people working related to agriculture and fisheries. However, there are twice as many representatives of the agriculture and fisheries sector as the education sector. The bigger problem is that the more than 4,000 fish and agriculture workers are actually not eligible to vote for the 60 representatives. Only the 158 voters approved by the government are eligible. Why is the composition of the election committee's representatives divided in this way? Whoever is eligible to become a voter is basically the last government's decision. This is enough to determine that the composition of the committee cannot be fair. Many sectors in the election committee are divided by industries, such as the catering, tourism, and publishing groups, etc. However, this does not mean that people in these industries can participate, but only the bosses of these industries can participate. This arrangement creates two problems. First of all, those who are interested in getting votes can give money to open many shell companies, which can increase their influence on the election committee. Second, the election committee is clearly leaning towards the business community. Candidates for the chief executive must first please the business community and not the people of Hong Kong. The people of Hong Kong hope to fight for equal and open universal suffrage through peaceful means. After reading the above part, everyone should understand that the Chinese Communist government has never thought about democratic elections in Hong Kong, nor has it thought about fulfilling its promises. There is only one way to honor the promise, and there can be countless excuses for violating the promise. Since the founding of the Communist Party of China, it is best at rogue and shameless methods. Taiwan has long been elected by the people, but after all, it faces the mainland across the sea. Hong Kong and the mainland are separated by a wall. Once Hong Kong is elected by the people, the impact on the mainland people will be immeasurable, and it will be enough to shake the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party's governance. In fact, the British Hong Kong government has been planning to implement more democratic governance in Hong Kong, but it has been unable to implement it due to opposition from the Chinese government. As early as 1956, Zhou Enlai proposed to the British government a reform plan to prevent Hong Kong people from ruling Hong Kong, and even warned that if Hong Kong and Britain held democratic elections, the Chinese government would use force to regain Hong Kong. Then, in order not to give the Chinese government an excuse to regain Hong Kong as soon as possible, the British government did not implement political reforms in Hong Kong. In the 1990s, Hong Kong Governor Patton proposed to speed up the process of democratization in Hong Kong, but was criticized by the CCP as eternal sinners. It can be seen that the CCP has never intended to give Hong Kong democracy. The Sino-British Joint Declaration is a legal document, which is not as good as toilet paper for the CCP. In the concept understood by the CCP, agreements and contracts are signed for future violations. Otherwise, why sign an agreement? Yes, this is the logic in their minds. In 1982, China's top leader Deng Xiaoping and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, known as the Iron Lady, fell into disagreements during the handover negotiations in Hong Kong. Deng Xiaoping lost his patience. He leaned across the table obliquely and said unabashedly that he could send an army at any time and regain this territory within a day. Thatcher replied, "Yes, Deng Xiaoping can do this, and Britain can hardly stop him, but it will mean the collapse of Hong Kong." Secret documents later declassified from these meetings show that Margaret Thatcher still feels deeply disturbed by China's insistence on restoring sovereignty over Hong Kong. There are good reasons for her worry. Deng Xiaoping's deputy, and then Chinese Prime Minister Zhao Ziyang warned Thatcher that when choosing between Hong Kong's prosperity and stability and China's sovereignty, the Communist Party will put sovereignty first. Xi Jinping is a leader who wants to be chairman for life and resolutely suppresses dissidents. His political opponents, journalists, lawyers, artists, and activists are increasingly being imprisoned. As many as 1 million Muslims are being held in re-education camps, which human rights organizations call brainwashing camps. The land and houses of these Uyghurs were confiscated, and their religion was called mental illness. Hong Kong is a flashpoint for the CCP. It is not only annoying but also an insult. Xi Jinping, who was thoroughly brainwashed by the false history forged by the CCP, regarded this piece of territory occupied by Britain during the Opium War in the 19th century is a symbol of China's humiliation by foreign powers. Strictly speaking, Hong Kong has not been messed up by Xi Jinping, but now he is likely to be the last leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and he needs to be responsible to all his predecessors. His term of office coincided with the outbreak of all the economic and political problems accumulated in the past 30 years, and Hong Kong has repeatedly delayed until the time of fulfilling its promises. Unfortunately, he happens to be the least educated and most insightful of all Chinese leaders. Li Ruye, a centenarian who understands the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the former head of the Organization Department of the Communist Party of China, said during his lifetime that he did not expect Xi Jinping's cultural level to be so low. Therefore, Xi Jinping's methods have always been simple and rude. The reason why he has not been overthrown so far is just like the former Soviet leader Brezhnev. Although everyone knows that Brezhnev is an idiot, because of this, the entire system of the Communist Party revolves around leaders. No matter how stupid the leader is, he will be praised as a great and wise leader. Therefore, Brezhnev has been known as a great and wise leader during his reign. Xi Jinping didn't know his stupidity either. Xi Jinping's violent methods in Hong Kong have allowed the CCP to stand on the opposite side of all democracies. In the past, no Chinese leader would act like Xi Jinping. They will not choose to smash Hong Kong. They will look for gentle ways to achieve the same goal. But Xi Jinping would do this, just like losing 10,000 soldiers just to kill 800 enemies. As long as there is no loss to the family, even if the loss of 100,000 soldiers is zero for Xi Jinping. To understand Xi Jinping's character and level, as we said in the previous issue, Xi Jinping will always make the worst decisions, and everything will bring the CCP one step closer to its demise. Otherwise, the CCP can survive for 10 or 20 years instead of being on the brink of extinction like it is now. The fifth thing that failed: cross-strait relations. Xi Jinping's radical measures on the Hong Kong issue have further verified the fact that the CCP has deprived Hong Kong of freedom and eroded the rights of the people of Hong Kong, if we say that the United States and the West still have differences on how to deal with the CCP in the future. The West's response to the issue of Hong Kong's national security law has become more and more consistent. The CCP's actions in Hong Kong have also directly led to the complete bankruptcy of its most concerned attempt to unify Taiwan with one country, two systems. The rejection of one country, two systems has become mainstream popular opinion in Taiwan. President Tsai Ing-wen said when attending a meeting of two think tanks in Washington via video on August 12, 2019, Seeing Beijing betraying its commitment to the people of Hong Kong and the international community and destroying this beacon of freedom has made us sad and frightened. She said that her government will handle cross-strait policies with a more cautious attitude, maintain peace across the Taiwan Strait, defend the forefront of Taiwan's democracy and freedom, and at the same time continue to cooperate with the United States to establish a more constructive approach to the common interests of the region. U.S. Taiwan Security Cooperation Relationship. In November 2019, Chinese man Wang Liqiang claimed to be a communist spy in Australia and claimed to have intervened in Taiwan's elections in an attempt to overthrow the Tsai Ing-wen government, which caused a lot of reports in the Australian media. As Wang Liqiang mentioned, Hong Kong's China Innovation Investment Corporation is the frontline of the People's Liberation Army to develop espionage activities. As a result, the chief executive of the company who entered Taiwan with a tourist visa at that time, the couple Xi was arrested before leaving Taiwan. This incident has been understated in China, saying that Wang Liqiang was absconding in debt, deliberately fabricating facts, etc. The major overseas Chinese media used various methods to show that the Xi couple could not be a CCP spy. People can't distinguish clearly, but this matter is of great significance. As Taiwan's 2020 presidential election was entering the final sprint, it was reported that on Christmas Eve on December 24, 2019, Wang Liqiang, who was applying for safe asylum in Australia, was received by the current Taiwan opposition party Kuomintang Deputy Secretary General Xi Jinping and Chinese businessman Mr. Sun death threats and bribery. After the incident, Wang Liqiang reported the case to the Australian police, and the Australian Federal Police immediately launched a secret investigation upon learning of it. According to reliable sources, with the assistance of the CCP police, K and Sun obtained contact information from Wang Liqiang's relatives in mainland China. They provided Wang Liqiang, who had been silent for a long time, with a text script and asked Wang Liqiang to record an interview. In the video, the script asked Wang Liqiang to publicly admit that Mr. Qiu, the former Secretary General of Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party, had given him a sum of money to bribe him, and asked him to admit that framing the CCP to bribe the KMT candidate Mr. Han was Qiu's instructions. At the same time, Wang Liqiang was also asked to admit in the video he has only seen the Xi couple a few times. Because of their wealth and status, he wants to pull them into the entire spy story. According to reliable sources, Xi Jinping promised to Wang Liqiang, the Chinese Communist Party will withdraw all charges against Wang Liqiang and repay Wang Liqiang's debt. If the Kuomintang wins the general election, Wang can choose to settle in Taiwan. On January 6, Qiu, a candidate for the legislature of the Taiwan New Party, stated in a press conference and on Facebook that the former Secretary General of the Democratic Progressive Party, Qiu, was involved in self-directed and performed Wang Liqiang's fake CCP spy case. The opposition Kuomintang even claimed that Xi Jinping will hold a press conference on Thursday to announce Wang Liqiang's video footage and expose how the DPP bought him for fraud. Unexpectedly, in the early hours of Thursday, January 9, the Australian media exposed the farce made by the Kuomintang. A spokesperson for the Australian Federal Police has publicly acknowledged the threats related to Wang. He said, "We're aware of the threats currently received by a man living in Australia. We will take this situation seriously and have launched an investigation." The Australian Federal Police stated in a statement that the goal of the Australian Counterintelligence System and Special Investigation Team is to combat all secret forces or espionage activities that attempt to interfere in Australia. It is reported that the Australian police are tracking Xi Jinping's agents in Australia. The level of conspiracy between the CCP and the Kuomintang is too low, making a big shame in front of the media. They underestimated the patience and ability of the Australian police. The layout of the Australian police not only exposed the fact that the KMT had colluded with the Chinese communists and blamed others, but also exposed the relationship between the Xi couple and Wang Liqiang. The high level of political parties in overseas countries directly threatened Wang Liqiang, which also confirmed Wang Liqiang's role. Australian police successfully fished Looking at the CCP police and Xi Jinping and others involved in this case, you know that the CCP has infiltrated Taiwan for a long time. This also shows that Xi Jinping and his wife are not only senior spies of the Chinese Communist Party, but also responsible for sabotaging Taiwan's elections. In fact, a few months before the Taiwan election, the Australian media published Wang Liqiang's confession to the Australian Military Intelligence Unit. This was deliberately released at this time. In fact, Wang Liqiang had already arrived in Australia a year before the Australian media published it. The Australian Military Intelligence Department spent a year investigating and verifying, and released the news before Taiwan's general election. Taiwan immediately introduced a reverse osmosis law in December 2019, blocking the back door of the CCP's infiltration. As for the outcome of the Xi Jinping couple, it has been important. In fact, just a few months before the Taiwan general election, the Australian media published Wang Liqiang's confession to the Australian Military Intelligence Agency. This was deliberately released at this time. In fact, Wang Liqiang had already arrived in Australia 1 year before the announcement by the Australian media. The Australian Military Intelligence Agency spent a year investigating and verifying, and released news before Taiwan's election. Taiwan immediately introduced a reverse osmosis law in December 2019 to block the backdoor of CCP infiltration. As for the Xi Jinping couple, whether they surrendered to Taiwan, reached some kind of agreement, or were sentenced, the result is no longer important. At least, the CCP has failed in both the light and dark lines of Taiwan. Obviously, because of the CCP's practice in Hong Kong, the one country, two systems attempt to reunify Taiwan was completely bankrupt. Tsai Ing-wen was elected president of the Republic of China with a historic 8 million votes. The rejection of one country, two systems has been Taiwan's mainstream public opinion. Xi Jinping destroyed this 30-year CCP plot against Taiwan in 1 year. Taiwan has not been fooled again. It is lucky for the Chinese people. On the dark side, due to Wang Liqiang's report and the arrest of Xi Jinping and his wife, Taiwan adopted the reverse osmosis law, which basically stopped the CCP's unscrupulous wooing of Taiwanese businessmen and closed the back door. Cross-strait relations have returned to before the 1990s. Otherwise, Taiwan's internal affairs will most likely be corroded by the CCP. Therefore, in fact, Xi Jinping did not mess up cross-strait relations as mentioned in the article 8 Things That Failed, but messed up cross-strait relations, which the CCP has set the direction of developments since the 1990s. From certain aspects for the CCP, it's a big mess, but it's fortunate for the whole of China. The sixth thing that failed. The CCP wanted to use money to hire Russia, but Putin looked down on it. Although Xi Jinping signed a $270 billion oil contract and a $400 billion gas contract with Russia as soon as he came to power, the urgency to win over Russia is clear. And since 2012, under the name of the United Nations Cooperation Organization, 5 army military exercises have been held, and 6 maritime joint military exercises and 6 special code military exercises have been held separately with Russia, including the largest one from August 9th to 13th this year. The joint military exercises with Russia surpassed the Hu Jintao era by 5 times. It looked like a military ally. It seemed to say, "We're playing with Russia. Who of you dares to beat me?" In the face of the rise of China and the current international situation, Putin's limited rational choice in the trilateral relationship between the United States, China and Russia is to maintain an unequal and equidistant exchange strategy. From this point of view, the long-term nature of Sino-Russian relations is not optimistic. On April 5, 2017, Putin signed the new constitution of the Russian Federation. This new constitution clearly defines belief in God as Russia's core value. It stipulates the Russian Federation, united in its 1,000-year history, safeguards the memory of its ancestors. The ancestors gave us ideas, belief in God, and the continued development of the Russian state. And the Federation recognizes this individual formed by history. This regulation not only connects today's Russia with historical Russia, but also connects today's Russia with belief in God. This is fundamentally different from the CCP. which believes in atheism and is completely opposite. On October 30, 2007, the anniversary of the victims of political persecution in Russia, Putin went to Budovo in the southern suburbs of Moscow to mourn the victims who died in the Stalin Purge. Putin said, "We know very well that 1937 was the most rampant year of the Great Purge. However, before that, the cruel persecution had lasted for several years. Such tragedies occurred in those that were fascinating on the surface but empty in content. When the idea is above the most basic human values such as human life, freedom and rights, hundreds of thousands or even millions of people have been killed, sent to prison, shot and tortured. These people have their own ideas and are not afraid to say them. They are the essence of the country." The tyranny that Putin criticized in this speech is exactly what the CCP has been doing for 72 years in power. The relationship between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping seems to be good, but this is not based on common values, but on the basis of mutual use of interests. For Putin, he was just using the CCP to serve the maximization of Russian national interests, and he did not regard the CCP as his family at all. With Russia, with a total value of nearly $700 billion, which resolved Russia's urgent need to be sanctioned by the United States. For each joint military exercise with Russia, China bears all the costs, which is equivalent to China's military assistance. Russian military training, with such a good person as Xi Jinping, why Putin refused. But it is impossible for Russia to work themselves to the bone for CCP. According to a notice issued by the Central International Department of the Communist Party of Russia, beginning in late September 2021, Putin's authorities have launched continuous arrests of the Communist Party of Russia, arresting dozens of leaders and supporters. The buildings of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party and the building of the Moscow City Committee of the Russian Communist Party were seized by the police for 3 days. The office of Melnikov, the first vice-chairman of the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party, was also seized. This incident is extraordinary. What's the reason? There is a theory that Putin learned that the CCP had secretly supported the Russian Communist Party to overthrow him for a long time, and the situation has intensified recently. Therefore, he made up his mind and launched a large-scale arrest. Judging from the personal relationship between Chinese Communist Party leader Xi Jinping and Putin, it is unlikely that Xi will support the Russian Communist Party to overthrow Putin. But within the CCP, some people may think and do so. In the past few decades, the CCP has been infiltrating all over the world. So how can it not infiltrate Russia? Putin's move shows that although his United Russia Party is the largest party in Russia and has been in power for a long time, he can tolerate the legal existence of the Russian Communist Party, but he will not hesitate to act against the serious illegal actions of the Russian Communist Party. There may be a shadow of the CCP behind the Russian Communist Party. Putin's move is also a warning to the CCP. On the surface, Putin and the CCP seem to be very close, but his defense against the CCP has not weakened in the slightest. In recent years, many Russian scientists have been arrested or sentenced for leaking state secrets to the CCP. In June 2019, Xi Jinping ended his visit to Russia and returned home. Public opinion generally believes that 11's move is a desire to cooperate with Russia in the context of Sino-US economic and trade frictions, and even China and Russia jointly resist the United States. During the period, the two countries signed a joint statement on the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Cooperative Partnership in the New Era, and a cooperation agreement of tens of billions of dollars. On the surface, it seems that he is going home with a full load, but when she just left, Putin actually used sit on the mountain and watch the tiger fight. When he was asked by the Russian media hostess about his views on the Sino-US trade war, to describe it, it thoroughly exposed Russia's contempt for the CCP. On the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party's official media caught Putin's congratulations on the video meeting with Xi Jinping, and reported a large number of Putin's grand congratulations. But Putin only said to Xi Jinping, "I congratulate you personally." Putin did not even give Xi Jinping the name of the United Russia Party. which shows Putin's attitude towards Xi Jinping. But the CCP always uses the spiritual victory method to explain everything. On October 22nd this year, according to Russian media reports, Putin was interviewed by the media at the annual meeting of the Volday International Debate Club held in Sochi. He was answering questions about NATO views Russia and China as a unified threat, and whether China and Russia should. When asked about alliance, Putin replied concisely that there is no closed military bloc between Russia and China, and there is no idea of establishing a Russian-Chinese military alliance. All speculations in this regard are unfounded. Putin's words gave a resounding slap in the face to the Xi Jinping authorities who wanted to drag Russia down. After Russian media TASS asked questions about Putin's remarks at a press conference of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the 22nd, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said that China and Russia are not allies, but are better than allies. I don't know how others would think about this. I think that since Xi Jinping took office, the spokespersons of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Chinese Communist Party have basically been people with schizophrenia. Xi Jinping himself is probably also a mental patient. What he said and did are always inconsistent. This is very similar to Mao Zedong. For example, Xi Jinping often talks about democracy, and even recently he said that China is the most democratic country. However, Xi Jinping's tenure may be the most authoritarian period in China in the past 40 years. But the Xi Jinping authorities really think they are democratic because they have written the word democracy on the walls of all government office buildings, so they are the most democratic government. Yes, I can only understand them like this. Finally, let me tell you a joke which is also a real thing that happened in China recently. The People's Daily website wanted to interact with netizens. It configured a sugarcane map on Weibo and asked everyone what sugarcane is called in the local dialect, but it did not expect to get a series of unexpected answers. The first netizen replied, "I don't know. Everything is subject to Xinhua News Agency's draft." The second netizen replied, "Well, I dare not talk nonsense." The third netizen replied, "Don't believe in rumors, don't spread rumors." The fourth netizen replied, "What the leader says is what it says." The fifth netizen replied, "No matter what it is, you say it is a deer, but we will never say it is a horse." The sixth netizen replied, "Waiting for Xinhua News Agency's manuscript." The seventh netizen replied, "Even if Xinhua News Agency said it was wheat, I would believe it." Subsequently, People's Daily Online quietly deleted this Weibo. Similar things often happen in China. It shows that many people in China express their dissatisfaction with the CCP in a smart way. Come on, Xi Jinping, the terminator of the CCP. That's it for today, and I will continue in the next issue. Thank you for watching. Please click like and subscribe.